My name is Elaine Carter, and I am 62 years old. For most of my adult life, I believed I understood what stability looked like. I thought I had built it brick by slow brick, through decades of persistence, quiet resilience, and a willingness to compromise more than I should have. By the time I met my husband, Mark, I wasn't looking for a fairy tale. I was simply looking for peace. We met at a community fundraiser, both of us volunteering at the silent auction table. He was charming in a soft-spoken way, with a gentle smile that made you feel like he was listening even before you spoke. It felt refreshing to meet a man who didn't need the whole room to turn toward him. I had lived through that kind of ego already in my first marriage. When we married 5 years later, it was a small ceremony at my sister's home. I had been a widow before, and he had experienced a difficult divorce. We both told ourselves that at our age, love didn't need an audience. What mattered was companionship, partnership, shared mornings with warm coffee and quiet evenings reading in the same room. And for a while, that's exactly what we had. But there was another layer to my calm demeanor, one I rarely spoke about. After losing my first husband and navigating a long legal battle with his estranged adult children over my own inheritance, I had grown protective of what I had worked for. My retirement savings, my home, the modest rental property I had maintained for decades, these were not luxuries. They were my safety net. So when Mark and I began discussing marriage, I insisted on a prenup. He hesitated at first, claiming he didn't care about my money. But eventually he agreed. He said, "It's just paperwork, Elaine. I'm not marrying you for any of that." And we signed. Years went by peacefully until tiny, nearly imperceptible cracks formed. He grew a little secretive about his finances. He started making comments about how he wished we shared everything, and how marriage should be about combining lives, not guarding assets. I brushed them off at first. People can speak carelessly when they're tired or stressed. But then, one spring morning, he looked at me from across the breakfast table and said, "Elaine, maybe it's time we revisit our financial arrangement. We don't need lawyers between us." The tone in his voice wasn't soft or affectionate. It was calculated. Something cold slid down my spine. He didn't know it yet, but I had already discovered the truth he was trying to conceal. And I was more prepared than he imagined. And that was the moment I realized my quiet, ordinary life was about to fracture. Because when a man suddenly doesn't want lawyers involved, it's usually because he needs them more than anyone else. And I wasn't about to let myself be blindsided again. When I think back to that morning, I remember how steady my voice sounded despite the tremor forming in my chest. "Why now, Mark?" I asked him. "What's prompting this?" He shrugged, trying to appear casual. But I had lived long enough to recognize a man who had practiced an answer before walking into a room. I just think marriages are stronger when everything's shared. No secrets. No divisions. He sipped his coffee, but the way he gripped the cup made his knuckles whiten. "We trust each other, don't we?" Trust. The irony nearly made me laugh then, though I held it in. Because just 2 weeks earlier, entirely by accident, I had opened a piece of mail addressed to him. We don't typically intercept each other's letters, but this envelope had no name visible through the little plastic window, just the logo of a bank I didn't recognize. I assumed it was the credit union where we held our joint checking account. Inside, however, was a notice about a delinquent loan under his name alone. Not a small loan. Not one taken recently. And certainly not one he had ever mentioned to me. The letter stated that because payments had gone unpaid for months, his bank intended to pursue asset evaluation for potential recovery. That phrase chilled me. I'd heard it before years ago, when my late husband's estate was being contested. It essentially meant the bank wanted to know if they could come after shared assets, including marital property, including my home. I had read it twice, then 3 times, hardly believing it. My husband, the man who often lectured me about us acting like a real team, had been using our marriage as a shield while sinking deeper into debt, and he hadn't breathed a word of it. At first, I considered giving him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he intended to tell me. Maybe he was ashamed. But the more I watched his behavior, the hushed phone calls, the statements he quickly tucked into his briefcase, the more the truth crystallized. He wasn't planning to tell me. He was planning to drag me down with him. And now here he sat, facing me as if he was the one being wronged. "Look," he said, spreading his hands. "You know I love you. You know I'm not after your money." But before he could finish, his phone chimed. He glanced at the screen, and in that instant a shadow crossed his face. He flipped the phone over without responding. That was when I knew this conversation wasn't about trust or emotional openness. It was about survival, his, not mine. Because somewhere out there was a financial mess he had created, and he was preparing to intertwine it with my life in a way he thought I wouldn't notice until it was too late. And I realized something else. He was counting on me being passive. He was counting on me not fighting back. But age teaches you many lessons, and one of them is this. Silence is not the same as weakness. I had been silent long enough. To understand why his betrayal cut so sharply, you need to know the story of my first husband, David. I was married to him for nearly 30 years before he passed unexpectedly. He was a steady man, not wealthy, but responsible. We lived a modest life, saved carefully, raised 2 children who grew into compassionate adults. But when he died, every fracture in the extended family surfaced. David's adult children from his first marriage, who had never cared much for me, contested the will. They argued that I had manipulated him into leaving me the house and a portion of his retirement funds. They claimed I didn't deserve what we had built together. The court battle was exhausting. I was grieving, confused, overwhelmed. And while I ultimately won, the process reshaped me. I learned to keep every receipt, every legal document, every bank statement. I learned that people's behavior around money often has little to do with fairness and everything to do with fear or entitlement. So when I met Mark, and he spoke so warmly about partnership and honesty, a part of me wanted to believe him with the innocence of a younger woman. But another part of me, the part sharpened by experience, knew better. I told him early on, I will never again enter a marriage without clear boundaries being documented. He had seemed understanding. In fact, he had insisted he admired my strength. That admiration shifted over time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began pressing for more shared accounts. Why keep everything separate, he'd ask. It makes me feel like you're preparing for the worst. I would tell him gently that it wasn't about him. It was about lessons learned through pain. He would smile, but the tension at the corners of his mouth stayed tight. He grew up the opposite of me. His parents bailed him out of financial mistakes repeatedly. Credit card debt, failed business ventures, impulsive purchases. He told me versions of these stories early in our relationship, but framed them as youthful missteps. What he never mentioned was that they hadn't stopped. He had simply become better at hiding them. As I sat across from him that morning, listening to him pretend his request was about emotional closeness, I saw his upbringing more clearly than ever. He wanted safety nets, plural, and he had decided I would be his newest one. But what he didn't know was that my past had prepared me too well. I didn't fear conflict anymore. I didn't fear standing alone. I had survived real loss. I had rebuilt myself once before, and I could do it again. What I needed now was clarity about the debt, the banks, the forms he had hidden. If he thought he could manipulate me into merging our assets before the truth came out, he was about to be deeply disappointed. Because a woman who has fought through grief and legal warfare does not enter battle unarmed. The next day, once Mark left for work, I began gathering what I already had. The delinquency notice. The half-shredded credit card statement I found in the recycling bin. The voicemail from a number he didn't recognize that mentioned urgency and collateral. I knew better than to jump to conclusions, but I also knew better than to ignore warning signs. I sat at my dining table, the morning sun warming the wood surface, and began building a timeline. When had he opened the loan? Why hadn't he told me? Why were the payments months behind? And why did the bank believe they could come after marital assets? There was only one explanation. He had not disclosed our prenup to them. I pulled out my folder, the one I kept in a locked drawer containing important documents. And there it was, the prenuptial agreement, signed, notarized, and legally recognized. It clearly stated that anything I owned prior to marriage remained exclusively mine. My home, my savings, my rental property, all separated by law. So why hadn't he shown this to his creditors? Why did they think our assets were shared? Unless he had claimed they were. I didn't want to believe it. But as I flipped through the scattered papers, I found a clue. A bank form listing joint marital home value, with a number that matched my property's appraisal. But he had never owned my home. He had moved into it after we married, but contributed nothing to the mortgage or its earlier renovations. That form was fraud. And if he had used my property as implied collateral without my permission, he wasn't just hiding debt. He was endangering my financial stability. I took a steady breath and began documenting every piece of evidence. Dates, account numbers, copies of the prenup, screenshots of the bank's threatening language. It became clearer by the minute. He wasn't trying to create emotional closeness when he said we didn't need lawyers between us. He was attempting to coax me into dissolving the prenup or merging our finances so his creditors could legally come after what I had built. By the time he came home that evening, my folder was full. I had arranged everything neatly, labeled each section. I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. I needed one more piece, a conversation with the bank. Not to pay anything, not to negotiate, but to confirm the story he had failed to tell me. The next morning, I drove to the branch listed on his letter. I introduced myself calmly to the representative and asked general questions about a loan connected to my husband. I did not mention the prenup yet. I wanted their version first. The representative, a young man with nervous energy, hesitated but then confirmed a loan in significant arrears. I asked what assets they believed were on file. He read aloud a list, and there it was, my home, inaccurately described as jointly owned. I thanked him, took notes, and walked out with the final piece I needed. Now I knew the truth. And so did they. But Mark did not know what I had in my folder. Not yet. That would come soon. Cliffhanger ends part 4. That evening, Mark came home in a strangely buoyant mood. He whistled as he hung his jacket, an old habit of his when he wanted to appear carefree. I studied him quietly as he walked into the kitchen. "Rough day?" he asked me casually, like nothing was brewing beneath the surface. "Oh," I told him. "I actually had a very productive day." I said it without smiling. He hesitated, sensing something off. "That's good. Listen, Elaine, about the conversation we had. I hope I didn't come off wrong. I just think we should be open with each other." "Open," I repeated as if tasting the word. "Yes, I agree. Open is good." I watched his face shift, the faintest hint of unease flickering behind his eyes. He sat across from me, folding his hands. "I was thinking maybe this weekend we could talk more about combining accounts. I want us to be aligned." I leaned forward. "Aligned," I said softly. "That's an interesting word, Mark. Because today, I discovered something that doesn't feel aligned at all." His breath hitched just slightly, small enough that most people would miss it, but I had learned to read these micro-expressions. "What do you mean?" I placed the first sheet of paper on the table. The delinquent loan notice. He stared at it, expression blank. Then I placed the bank form listing my home as a marital asset. His face went pale. "I spoke to the bank today," I said calmly. "They believe my property is jointly owned. They also believe our assets can be used to recoup your debt. I found this interesting, given that you and I both signed a legally binding document that states otherwise." He swallowed. "Twice. Elaine, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I told him. "But before you attempt to, I want you to understand something. I know everything. I know about the loan. I know about the missed payments. I know you didn't disclose the prenup to them. And I know you intended to convince me to dissolve it before your creditors came knocking." His lips parted, but no words emerged. "I trusted you," I said, my voice steady. "And you made decisions that put my home, my safety, at risk. You hoped I wouldn't notice. You hoped age had made me naive." He shook his head quickly, panic rising. No, Elaine, it wasn't like that. I was going to handle it. I just needed more time. Time to entangle my assets with yours?" I asked. He dropped his gaze. Silence. And then, quietly, I placed the prenup on the table between us. I tapped it lightly. "This," I said, "is the only reason my life isn't already burning down around your mistakes." He looked at the document as if it were a weapon. And perhaps, in a way, it was. I sat back in my chair, letting the stillness between us amplify the truth he could no longer escape. "Mark," I said, my tone measured, "you're going to tell me everything now. All of it. Without lying. Without softening the edges. Because the era of half-truths in this house is over." He clasped his hands together, fingers trembling. "It started a few years ago," he said. "I took out a loan to help my brother after he lost his job. I didn't want to worry you. I thought I could manage the payments myself. I let him continue, though I knew the story wasn't that simple. But then," he said, "one of my investments tanked. I kept thinking it would bounce back, and I'd repay the loan before you ever knew. And so you listed my home as collateral?" I asked. His cheeks flushed. "I didn't list it exactly. The bank rep misinterpreted." "Stop," I said gently. "Don't try to spin this. You let them believe we shared assets. You let them believe my property was fair game. That wasn't a misinterpretation. That was omission. And omission is just a polished form of deceit." He lowered his head. You could have come to me, I continued. I'm not unreasonable. I've lived long enough to know people make mistakes. But you didn't want help. You wanted cover. He stiffened at the word. I wasn't trying to use you. Then what were you trying to do? I asked. When you sat at this table telling me we should dissolve the legal boundaries protecting my home. Why did you say we didn't need lawyers between us? His eyes glistened, but I felt no satisfaction in his fear. This wasn't about cruelty. This was about truth. I panicked, he admitted. The bank contacted me again. They said they'd pursue assets, and that's when I realized the prenup protected you. I thought if we combined finances, even symbolically, they'd go easier on me. I nodded slowly. So you wanted me to sacrifice my security so you could repair your image. Not your finances, your image. He didn't deny it. I placed the folder of evidence in front of him. I've documented everything. Every letter. Every form. Every omission. And I've already spoken to a lawyer. His head snapped up. Elaine, please. Mark, I said with calm finality. This isn't revenge. This is accountability. He blinked rapidly. What happens now? I met his gaze steadily. Now we separate our lives completely. Financially. Legally. And you will contact that bank first thing tomorrow morning and inform them that you misrepresented your marital assets. You will tell them you have no claim to my property. And then you will deal with your debt alone. His breath shuddered. And us? What about us? I folded my hands. That depends on whether you're capable of rebuilding trust. But I won't discuss marriage until the threat to my home is gone. He stared at me, wounded, but beneath that was something else, recognition. He had underestimated me. And now he understood the cost. The next morning, Mark made the call. I stood nearby, listening carefully as he told the bank representative what he should have told them months ago. He stated clearly, repeatedly, that my home was owned solely by me and protected by a prenuptial agreement. He answered their follow-up questions with a trembling honesty I had never heard from him before. When the call ended, the bank confirmed in writing that I was not liable, nor was my property eligible for any form of collection. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. But consequences didn't end there. That week, I asked him to move into the downstairs guest suite. Not as punishment, but as space for both of us. He looked devastated but complied. Over the next few days, he forwarded his financial statements to the lawyer I had engaged. I monitored from a distance. His debt was far worse than he had admitted. Multiple loans. A drained savings account. Creditors he had ignored for months. And yet, for the first time, he stopped hiding. I watched him spend hours on the phone negotiating repayment plans. I saw him cancel subscriptions, sell equipment he no longer used, and close accounts he had opened impulsively. He took responsibility. Real responsibility. And it was difficult for him. Years of avoidance had conditioned him to push problems aside until they grew teeth. The lawyer drew up a post-nuptial agreement clarifying financial separation even more explicitly than the prenup. Mark signed it without hesitation. I signed it as well. And then, after weeks of tension, I finally agreed to sit down with him again. We talked for hours about his fear, my distrust, our separate pasts. He cried. I didn't, not because I was cold, but because I had shed all my tears years ago in courtrooms where widows aren't given the benefit of the doubt. By the end of our conversation, I realized something unexpected. I didn't hate him. I wasn't even angry anymore. What I felt was clarity. And with clarity came choice. I could walk away and no one would blame me. But I could also stay if I believed growth was possible. And for the first time, I sensed sincerity in him. Not desperation, but humility. So I made my decision. But before I could speak it aloud, he asked me a question I didn't anticipate. Elaine, he said quietly, is this the end for us? And in that moment, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. Easygoing husband I had married years ago. He was humanized now, uncomfortable with his own reflection, finally forced to confront the parts of himself he'd avoided for decades. No, I said softly. This isn't the end, but it is the beginning of something different. He lifted his head slowly. I continued. We cannot go back to what we were. Trust doesn't simply snap back into its old shape, but it can be rebuilt, brick by brick, with honesty, with transparency, with respect. He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. I won't let your mistakes ruin my future, I said gently. But I also won't let them define yours. You have work to do, financially, emotionally, personally. And you will do it without using me as a scaffold. But if you do it sincerely, if you rebuild yourself, then perhaps we can rebuild us. He reached for my hand, but I didn't offer it yet. Not out of cruelty, but out of truth. Healing takes patience, distance, boundaries. I watched him accept that. In the months that followed, he made genuine progress. He paid off his smallest debts first, then negotiated structured repayment for the larger ones. He attended financial counseling. He apologized, to me, to his brother, even to himself. And slowly, I allowed him back into my daily life. Not as a man who needed me to protect him, but as a partner learning how to stand on his own. Our marriage didn't collapse, but it transformed. Now, when people ask whether I regret insisting on a prenup, I smile and tell them no. The prenup didn't divide us. It saved us. It protected me, yes, but it also forced Mark to face himself rather than hiding behind me. And that is the real heart of revenge. Not spite, not punishment, but truth revealed so clearly that it leaves no room for deception to survive. As for me, I've learned something vital in all of this. Boundaries are not barriers. They are the scaffolding of a healthy life. And love, real love, can thrive within them. If you've ever faced a similar situation, betrayal, hidden debts, or a partner who tried to twist trust into leverage, I'd like to hear your story. What did you learn? What would you do differently now? Let's talk about it in the comments, because your story might help someone else find their clarity too.